The 3rd of September, 1878 was a Tuesday. In the city of London, the last warmth of summer had settled over the river, and the day had been fine. Sunset came, as it did that time of year, at 6:42 in the evening. By that hour, the paddle steamer Princess Alice was already on her return leg, running westward through the lower Thames. She had made the full round trip, from Swan Pier in the city, down to Gravesend and Sheerness, and now she was coming home through the industrial stretches of river below Woolwich. Aboard her were several hundred passengers, men, women and children who had paid 2 shillings each for the day and were expecting to be home by 9 o'clock. The music had long since stopped at Rocherville Gardens. The children were asleep, or nearly. The evening air was cooling over the water. Coming the other way, out toward the sea, was the Bywell Castle. She was a collier, iron-hulled, 1,376 gross registered tons, built at Newcastle. She was running empty, eastward, making for the open water. At approximately 20 minutes to 8 in the evening, at the bend in the river, below Tripcock Point, at a place called Gallions Reach, the bow of the Bywell Castle struck the Princess Alice on her starboard side. An eyewitness on the bank later described what happened to the paddle steamer as being like cutting a piece of bread with a knife. She sank in 4 minutes. 650 people went into the Thames. The lights of Woolwich were visible from the water. The city was right there. And every minute the survivors spent in the river at Gallions Reach made their survival less likely, not more. Because the stretch of the Thames into which they had fallen was, at that precise hour, the outfall point for 75 million gallons of London's raw, untreated sewage, discharged on the evening ebb tide, as it was discharged every evening, from the great outfall pipes at Barking Creek and Crossness. The city's celebrated public health infrastructure had made Gallions Reach, at the moment 650 people fell into it, as close to an open sewer as the Thames had ever been. There was no act of God here. There was no storm, no earthquake, no hidden reef. There was a navigation rule applied at the wrong moment, a passenger list that no one had ever been legally required to keep, life-saving equipment that fell short of what several hundred people in the water needed, and an engineering triumph that had cleaned central London by moving its problem 50 miles downstream. Every one of those facts had a cause. Every cause had a decision behind it. Most of those decisions were made years before the evening of the 3rd of September, 1878. This is the story of the Princess Alice. Before we go any further, this channel is only just beginning, and if these forgotten disasters of Victorian Britain are the kind of history that you find yourself drawn to, please consider subscribing so the next one reaches you. A like helps other people find these stories, and do leave a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. It genuinely matters to know. To understand the people aboard the Princess Alice, you first have to understand what a river excursion represented to a working Londoner in the 1870s. It was not a holiday in any sense that a prosperous family would have recognised. It was something smaller and harder won, a single day claimed from the rhythm of labour in which the ordinary texture of life gave way, briefly, to something else entirely, the bank holidays. Act of 1871 had given that pause a legal form for the first time. Certain days were now formally set apart from commercial obligation, and the pleasure steamer companies had built their summer season around them. By 1878, the route from London Bridge down to Gravesend and the gardens at Rocherville was one of the most popular excursions available in the English capital at any price. Rocherville Gardens sat above the chalk cliffs at the edge of Kent, 3 terraced acres of paths and grottos and bandstands and dancing platforms, a theatre, a maze and a programme of entertainment that ran from mid-morning until the last boats departed. On a summer afternoon, it drew thousands, families from Bermondsey and Poplar and Woolwich and Plumstead and the close-packed streets south of the river, people for whom the 2-shilling return ticket represented a genuine calculation rather than an afterthought. You boarded at Swan Pier or at Blackwall, or at North Woolwich, wherever the steamer stopped nearest your home. You spent the crossing on the open deck, watching the working waterfront of the great city give way to the widening estuary. The children pressed against the rail. A band played on the lower deck. You ate what you had brought, because the cost of the day was already calculated to the penny. And at Rocherville, the dancing cost nothing to watch. When the light began to go, you made your way back to the pier and the steamer carried you home. The Princess Alice had run this route for long enough to be familiar to the river. She had been built in 1865 at Greenock by Caird and Company, and she came into the service of the London Steamboat Company in the years that followed. She was 219 feet long, 432 gross registered tons, driven by her side-mounted paddle wheels, slender and clean in the water, with a licensed calm water capacity of 936 passengers. She was well regarded, she was maintained. She was not new, but she was known on the river, and the people who boarded her for the Rocherville run did so without hesitation. Her captain on the 3rd of September was William Grinstead, 47 years old, who had commanded her for some time. The inquest convened after the disaster would hear evidence about his character from those who'd worked alongside him, and the words those witnesses used were consistent: sober, steady, careful. A professional in the full meaning that word carried in 1878, when a Thames river master held direct personal responsibility for the lives of the hundreds he carried. Grinstead was on the bridge that evening, in the ordinary way, doing the ordinary work of bringing his vessel home. His first mate, George Thomas Long, was also on duty. The second mate, Ralph Wilkinson, was aboard, and at the wheel of the Princess Alice, in the minutes that mattered most, was the helmsman John Ayres. Ayres's experience navigating the specific conditions of the Thames would later be described at the inquiries as limited. That detail, unremarkable in a crew roster, would come to carry considerable weight. The Bywell Castle coming toward them was a different vessel in every measurable respect. 254 feet long, 1,376 gross registered tons, built in Newcastle in 1869 and owned by Messrs Hall of Newcastle. Where the Princess Alice was built for passengers and pleasure, the Bywell Castle was built for cargo and endurance. An iron-hulled collier with a crew of 40 and the kind of mass and momentum that made her, at speed, effectively unstoppable at close range. On the evening of the 3rd of September, she was running empty, light ship, making for Newcastle to load coal bound for Alexandria, Egypt, and she was making good time. On her bridge was Captain Thomas Harrison. At his side was the vessel's pilot, Christopher Dix. Dix had worked the Thames professionally for 34 years. He knew every reach and bend and tidal condition between Gravesend and the Pool of London. If experience could prevent a catastrophe, Dix had experience enough for 2 men. The London Steamboat Company ran its business within the law. That is the first thing to understand about the Princess Alice, and it is the most important thing to understand, because the disaster that killed 650 people was not the result of anyone doing something illegal. It was the result in large part of what the law did not require. The company was not obligated to keep a passenger list. No regulation compelled it to count and record the names of the people who stepped aboard at each stop along the route. The legal capacity of the Princess Alice was 936 passengers under calm water conditions. How many were aboard on the evening of the 3rd of September is a question that cannot be answered, not because the record was lost, but because no record was ever made. The people who drowned that evening went into the Thames, unnamed and uncounted by the company that had taken their fares. That is not a fact recoverable from any archive. It is a permanent absence. The provision of life-saving equipment aboard the Princess Alice was also a matter left to the company's judgment. What constituted adequate provision of lifebelts and buoyant apparatus for nearly 1,000 passengers on a Thames pleasure steamer was not prescribed by the state. The company made that determination itself. The coroner's inquest would subsequently find the provision insufficient for the number of people carried. The company, in making the determination it had made, had broken no law. The number of crew required to manage a maritime emergency aboard a vessel carrying several hundred passengers was, in 1878, equally a matter for the operator. The inquest would find the Princess Alice inadequately crewed. The company had, within the framework of the regulations as they stood, done nothing wrong. These were not decisions made in defiance of the rules. They were the natural consequence of a regulatory environment that had not kept pace with the volume, the scale, and the human weight of what the Victorian pleasure steamer trade had become. The London Steamboat Company was a profitable business doing legal things. The structural conditions that would contribute to 650 deaths were built into its operation years before the evening of the 3rd of September. The Thames navigation rules that governed every steam vessel on the tidal river were administered by the Thames Conservancy and drawn from the broader framework of merchant shipping regulation. At their centre, for any situation involving two steam vessels approaching each other head-on, stood Rule 29. The rule was clear in its text. Each vessel must alter its course to starboard, so that they pass on their port sides, each observing the other's red portside navigation light, port to port. The principle was established and known. The application, on a working tidal river with vessels of radically different sizes and handling characteristics, was not always straightforward. A practice had developed among the operators of pleasure steamers of taking the South Bank line through certain stretches of the lower river, including Gallions Reach. The logic was economical. On the flood tide, the inshore water near the South Bank ran slower, which meant the engines did less work. The South Bank line saved fuel, it saved time. On a commercial service running multiple trips each day, those savings accumulated, and the practice had been established for long enough that no one questioned it. The problem with the South Bank line at Gallions Reach was a problem of geometry. A westbound pleasure steamer taking the shallow inshore course, encountering an eastbound collier taking the deeper channel midstream, was on a course that crossed the collier's path rather than passing clear of it. Under Rule 29, the pleasure steamer should alter to starboard, should turn further toward the South Bank. But the geometry of the bend and the relative positions of the two vessels could make it unclear whether that manoeuvre would bring them clear of each other or directly into each other's way. This was a known feature of that stretch of river. It was a documented navigational ambiguity. It had not been formally addressed, regulated away, or resolved by any official body by the autumn of 1878. The state of the Thames at Gallions Reach and Barking Reach was also well documented. Joseph Bazalgette's great sewer network had done what it was built to do, and London's debt to it was real. By the early 1870s, the river in the city itself was cleaner than it had been in living memory. The great stink of 1858, when the Thames at Westminster had stank so profoundly in the summer heat that Parliament had hung curtains soaked in lime chloride over its windows and still barely functioned, was a memory that polite discourse was happy to leave behind. Bazalgette's intercepting sewers, 1,100 miles of new street drains feeding into 82 miles of main sewer running east on both sides of the river, were celebrated across the empire as a monument to Victorian engineering and Victorian will. What the celebration did not foreground was the mechanism by which the problem had been solved. The sewage that had once fouled the Thames at Westminster had not been treated. It had been moved. Every gallon of London's waste now travelled east, through Bazalgette's sewers, to two outfall points, the northern outfall at Barking Creek and the southern outfall at Crossness on the opposite bank. There in vast underground reservoirs, it was held and then released, twice daily, on the ebb tide, directly into the river. There was no treatment, there was no purification. The mechanism was dilution and dispersal, and the intended dispersal point was the open sea. A contemporary record describes the discharge: two continuous columns of decomposed fermenting sewage, hissing like soda water with baneful gases, so black that the water is stained for miles. That description was not written in shocked retrospect after the Princess Alice disaster. It was the known daily condition of the Thames at Barking Reach, visible to everyone who lived or worked near the outfall points, accepted as the cost of having cleaned up the river further upstream. The Metropolitan Board of Works knew. The engineers who maintained the system knew. The discharge schedule was fixed, regular, and entirely independent of anything else that happened on the river. Nobody had thought to ask what would happen to the survivors of a collision at Gallions Reach. On the evening of the 3rd of September, the ebb tide had come and the sewers had discharged. The water at Gallions Reach, at the hour the Princess Alice made her approach to Tripcock Point, was at its most contaminated. It had been at its most contaminated at that hour every day for years. The navigational decisions that would bring the two vessels together did not begin at the moment of impact. They accumulated in the ordinary way of two vessels proceeding about their ordinary business, the fatal geometry assembling itself across the course of an otherwise unremarkable evening voyage. The Princess Alice, on her westbound return leg, took the South Bank line through Gallions Reach. This was the established practice. It was the course her officers had taken on this route before, and there was no reason, on the evening of the 3rd of September, to deviate from it. Captain Grinstead stood on his bridge in the fading light. The first mate was at his post. The helmsman Ayers was at the wheel. Ahead, coming eastward through the Reach, was the Bywell Castle. What pilot Christopher Dix saw from the Bywell Castle's bridge as the two vessels approached was the navigation lights of the Princess Alice, and specifically her red portside light. Under Rule 29, that configuration, a red light visible from the approaching vessel, should have indicated that the two vessels were going to pass safely on their port sides. Dix held his course. He was a 34-year veteran of the Thames. He made the assessment that his experience entitled him to make. At some point in the seconds that followed, and this is the moment that no inquiry, no civil court, and no subsequent document was ever able to fix with final certainty, something changed aboard the Princess Alice. The helmsman John Ayers put the helm to starboard. The bow of the Princess Alice turned, not toward the south bank, away from the Bywell Castle. Across the Bywell Castle's path, Weather Ayers was applying Rule 29 as he understood it, turning toward the starboard under the belief that this would bring the vessels into a port-to-port passage, or whether he was attempting a last-second avoidance that went wrong, or whether there was a miscommunication on the bridge in the fading light and the noise of two vessels at close range is not established in the record with certainty. The Board of Trade would spend weeks in the autumn of 1878 trying to answer that question. It would reach a verdict. That verdict would be contested. On the Bywell Castle's bridge, Christopher Dix saw the Princess Alice swing across his bow and ordered the engines reversed at full speed. He had 34 years of experience on the Thames, and he knew in the same instant that a 1,376-ton collier running at speed could not stop in the distance now remaining between the two vessels. From the bridge of the Princess Alice in the last moments before the impact, Captain William Grinstead's voice carried across the water. "Where are you coming to? Good God, where are you coming to?" The Bywell Castle's bow struck the Princess Alice on her starboard side, just forward of the paddle box, at an angle of approximately 13 degrees. The impact effectively bisected the paddle steamer. The witness on the bank had the words for it: like cutting a piece of bread with a knife. She did not capsize. She did not heel slowly over. She split, bow from stern, and the boilers separating as the hull went under, and she went down. The saloon passengers below decks had, in the 4 minutes that followed, almost no warning and almost no time. Only 2 people were pulled alive from below decks. A diver who descended to the wreck in the days that followed found the saloon doorways jammed with the dead, many of them standing upright, many of them women, caught at the thresholds in the dark water. On the surface, 650 people were in the Thames. The Bywell Castle's crew responded immediately. Captain Harrison brought his vessel alongside as best he could and ordered everything buoyant thrown over the side. Ropes, lifebuoys, spars, anything that could keep a person afloat. The crew worked the ropes and pulled survivors from the water hand over hand. The Bywell Castle's own lifeboat was launched and recovered 14 people directly. The crew, working from the ship's side and from the lifeboat, brought approximately 35 survivors aboard the collier before the conditions in the water made further direct rescue impossible. From the banks, watermen and factory workers who had seen or heard the collision launched whatever small craft they could find. The Thames was worked by hundreds of men whose livelihoods depended on small boats, and some of them were on the water within minutes of the sinking. But the scale of what had happened at Gallions Reach on the evening of the 3rd of September dwarfed any response that private enterprise and personal courage could mount. The Thames Marine Police had no steam launches. Every vessel in the River Police's fleet was human-powered, rowing boats on a tidal river with a current running at several knots in the dark. The police boats reached the scene. They could not work it effectively. They recovered whom they could. The Princess Alice's sister vessel, the Duke of Teck, arrived at Gallions Reach 10 minutes after the Princess Alice had gone under. By the time the Duke of Teck was on the scene, those who could be saved from the surface had largely already been saved or had drowned. The vessel that had the best capability to have organised a coordinated rescue effort arrived too late to make the difference that mattered. Approximately 130 people were brought out of the Thames alive that evening. Several of them were already dying, though no one who pulled them from the water could have known precisely why. The Thames at Gallions Reach on the evening of the 3rd of September was what it had been on every evening of the preceding years, heavily contaminated with the raw sewage discharged from the outfall works upstream. The survivors who had swallowed Thames water at Gallions Reach on the evening of the collision had swallowed something worse than river water. One survivor, a man named Mr. Huddett, gave testimony at the inquest about what the water had been like. He said, "I noticed something very peculiar in the water. Both the taste and smell were something dreadful. The most horrid water I ever tasted." At least 16 of the 130 people rescued from the Thames that evening died within 2 weeks of the collision. They had survived the sinking. They died from the river. The bodies of those who did not survive the water began to surface and drift with the tide in the hours and days that followed. The Times, reporting on the 5th of September, 2 days after the disaster, used a single plain sentence: "Dead bodies are continually being washed ashore." Bodies were found upriver as far as Limehouse and downstream as far as Erith. The scale of the recovery effort required resources far beyond what the local authorities had on hand. 250 additional Metropolitan Police officers were deployed to manage the crowds gathering along the banks. Local watermen were pressed into service and paid a minimum of 5 shillings per body recovered at a day rate of £2 for sustained work. The bodies were brought to Woolwich dockyard, which became the primary temporary mortuary. 19 of them were laid in the boardroom of the London Steamboat Company itself, a detail so stark that no editorial comment is needed. 28 more were placed in the town hall, among them the wife of one of the company's own managers, and her 4 children. Relatives came from across East London to search for their dead, moving between the dockyard and the town hall and the riverbank, looking at faces. Many of those faces could not be identified. The bodies were decomposing at a rate that alarmed those who handled them, a consequence of extended immersion in heavily contaminated water. On the 9th of September, 1878, 6 days after the disaster, a mass burial was held at Woolwich Cemetery. Several thousand people gathered. Between 74 and 92 unidentified bodies were interred in a common grave. On that same day, more than 150 private funerals took place across the eastern suburbs of London. Streets in Woolwich and Plumstead, and Greenwich and Bermondsey stood quieter than they ever had. In the houses where a family had not come home from the Rocherville trip, a particular kind of silence had settled that would not lift for years. The Lord Mayor of London opened the Mansion House Fund within days of the disaster. It raised £35,000, a sum equivalent, at the values of a later century, to several £1,000,000. Queen Victoria donated £100. The Prince and Princess of Wales gave £50. The fund supported the bereaved families, the widowers with no income, the children left without mothers, the households that had lost their wage earner, along with everything else. There was no criminal proceeding. No one was charged. The inquiry process, when it came, would spend months attempting to establish where the blame lay, and it would reach 3 different verdicts in 3 different forums that did not agree with each other. The coroner's inquest opened on the 4th of September 1878, the day after the disaster. 2 coroners took jurisdiction, Charles Carter for West Kent and Charles Lewis for South Essex, reflecting the location of the wreck straddling county boundaries. The inquest would hear evidence for months. It would not return its verdict until the 14th of November, after 12 hours of jury deliberation. The witnesses called at the inquest included survivors of the Princess Alice, the crew of the Bywell Castle, and a range of professional observers. Among the most significant was Abraham Dennis, master of a steam vessel called the Bonetta, which had been present in Gallions Reach at the moment of the collision. Dennis was a direct eyewitness. He gave testimony about what he had seen from his own vessel in the moments before the impact. His account was straightforward and unambiguous. In Dennis's view, the cause of the casualty was the Bywell Castle porting helm as she approached the Princess Alice. He was describing a different sequence of events from the one that Christopher Dix and Captain Harrison presented. Under Dennis's account, it was the Bywell Castle, not the Princess Alice alone, that had made the movement that brought the 2 vessels into contact. The coroner's jury weighed this testimony alongside the accounts of Dix, Harrison, and the surviving officers of the Princess Alice. After 12 hours of deliberation, it returned a verdict of mutual fault. The collision was not willful. The Bywell Castle had failed to ease, stop, and reverse her engines in adequate time. The Princess Alice had failed to stop and go astern, and had violated the sailing rules. Both vessels bore responsibility. The jury went further. It found that the Princess Alice was seaworthy, but it also found that she had been inadequately crewed for the number of passengers she carried, that she had carried an excessive number of passengers, and that her provision of life-saving equipment had been insufficient. These were findings not about the collision itself, but about the structural conditions in which the vessel had been operating. The London Steamboat Company had, in the jury's view, sent a vessel out with too many people aboard and too little equipment to save them. 4 of the jurors refused to sign the verdict. The division was not publicly explained, but its existence in the record indicates that the jury's deliberations had been genuinely contested even after 12 hours. The Board of Trade inquiry ran concurrently with the inquest, opening on the 14th of October and concluding on the 6th of November, 1878. It approached the question of fault differently from the coroner's jury. Where the inquest had ranged across the structural failings of the London Steamboat Company, the Board of Trade inquiry focused its analysis on the navigation rules and the conduct of the vessels in the moments before impact. Its conclusion was different and considerably more definite. The Board of Trade found the Princess Alice solely at fault. The Bywell Castle, in the board's assessment, had done nothing wrong. The Princess Alice had violated Rule 29, Section D of the Thames Steering and Sailing Rules, the requirement that vessels meeting head-on must each alter to starboard to pass port to port. The helmsman Ayers had moved the wheel in a direction that, given the specific positions of the 2 vessels at that moment, placed the Princess Alice directly in the Bywell Castle's path. Christopher Dix, the board found, had acted correctly and could not have prevented the collision once the Princess Alice crossed his bow. This was a precise and technical finding, grounded in the geometry of the collision and the requirements of the rule. It was also a finding that placed the entire legal weight of 650 deaths on a vessel whose master was dead and whose helmsman had, by all accounts, including his own, made an error in the fog of a low-light close-quarters encounter on a busy river. And yet, in a detail that the inquiry record makes clear without fully explaining, the Board of Trade suspended the licence of Captain Thomas Harrison, master of the Bywell Castle, even while finding the Bywell Castle blameless. It also suspended the licence of Christopher Dix. The licence of First Mate George Thomas Long of the Princess Alice was suspended as well. The board had found one vessel solely at fault and then proceeded to sanction the officers of both. The civil action that followed introduced a third verdict. The London Steamboat Company brought a claim in the High Court against the owners of the Bywell Castle for £20,000 in damages. The Bywell Castle's owners countersued for £2,000. The High Court found both vessels culpable. The legal record of the Princess Alice disaster thus stands in three parts: a coroner's jury finding mutual fault, a Board of Trade inquiry finding the Princess Alice alone at fault, and a High Court civil judgment finding both vessels at fault. No single verdict commands universal authority. No criminal conviction was ever secured. The deeper accountability question, the one that the inquiries, for all their thoroughness, could not resolve, was the question of the London Steamboat Company itself. The coroner's jury had found the vessel inadequately crewed, excessively loaded, and insufficiently equipped with life-saving gear. These were serious findings, but they were findings about a legal operation. The company had not broken any rules by sending the Princess Alice out as it had. The rules that were broken, the navigation rule on the night, were broken by the helmsman in the seconds before a collision, not by the corporate directors in the years of commercial operation that preceded it. The company had kept no passenger list. The law did not require one. There was, therefore, no way to establish with certainty how many people had been aboard, no way to know how many were missing, and no way to notify the families of those whose bodies were never recovered. The permanent uncertainty of the death toll, 650, is the working figure. The range is 600 to 700, and the exact number is unknowable, flows directly from that single legal gap. Captain Grinstead, described as sober, steady and careful, whose ship had made the navigational error, or whose helmsman had, in the crucial seconds, made the error, was dead. His body was recovered from the Thames. He could not speak in his own defence. The Board of Trade placed its primary finding of fault on his vessel. He was not alive to contest it, or to explain what he had seen from his bridge, or to give his account of the seconds before the Bywell Castle struck. The Bywell Castle herself survived the inquiry, had her damage repaired, and returned to service. She was bound for the open sea. She sailed from the Thames and continued trading. On the 29th of January 1883, she was reported missing on a voyage from Alexandria to Hull. She was lost in a gale in the Bay of Biscay, believed sunk in the same storm that took the Kenmure Castle in February of that year. All 40 of her crew perished. Christopher Dix, the 34-year Thames pilot, who had ordered engines reversed in the last seconds before the collision at Gallions Reach, had long since returned to his work on the river. The Bywell Castle took her secrets with her to the floor of the Atlantic, and the exact account of what Christopher Dix saw on his bridge at 20 minutes to 8 on the evening of the 3rd of September was never subjected to any further formal examination. The investigations, the civil action, and the press coverage of the autumn and winter of 1878 had exposed in public a set of conditions that no government inquiry had previously forced into the open in quite this way. No passenger list, inadequate life-saving provision, insufficient crew, navigation rules that could produce two diametrically opposed official verdicts from two official bodies examining the same evidence, a river police with no steam capability, a river contaminated at its most critical stretch by the twice-daily discharge of the entire city's sewage. Each of those conditions was, in legal terms, legitimate in 1878. Each of them required a specific decision to change. The changes came, though not all at once, and not all with the speed that 650 deaths might have seemed to demand. The navigation rules governing Thames steam traffic were reviewed and tightened in the aftermath of the disaster. The specific ambiguities of the port-to-port rule, as it applied to vessels taking different lines through a reach, the slack water line that the Princess Alice had been following against the channel line of the Bywell Castle, were formally addressed. The requirement for vessels meeting head-on was clarified and more strictly codified. Lord Sandon, representing the government in Parliament in the immediate aftermath of the disaster, announced a committee to review the rules. The direction of reform was clear, even where the specific instrument took time to work through the machinery of administration. The question of the Thames Marine Police took longer, but it was answered. The coroner's inquest had found explicitly, on the record, that the police's rowing boat capability was inadequate for any emergency on a busy tidal river. The first steam launches entered service with the Thames Police in the mid-1880s. By 1898, 8 steam launches were operating on the river. The rowing boats did not disappear, but they were no longer the only resource available when something went wrong on the water. The sewage outfall at Gallions Reach, the thing that had turned the water into a secondary cause of death, was the most consequential, long-term change of all, and it was the one most directly driven by the public scandal of the Princess Alice disaster. The condition of the Thames at the outfall points had been known and tolerated for years. The disaster made it impossible to tolerate in quite the same way. The Metropolitan Board of Works began, from the 1880s onward, to implement a system of sewage treatment and sea disposal. Sludge boats, specially built steam vessels, were commissioned to collect the concentrated sewage solids from Barking and Crossness and transport them out to sea for open water disposal, rather than releasing raw sewage directly into the tidal river. The first of those sludge boats entered service in June of 1887. The Board of Works named her the Bazalgette after the engineer of the sewer network, whose outfall pipes had poisoned the survivors of the Princess Alice. That naming was either a tribute or an irony, depending on how you read it. The sea disposal programme that the Bazalgette inaugurated ran for over a century. It continued until December of 1998, 110 years after the disaster, when improved sewage treatment technology finally made the practice unnecessary. The Thames today sustains salmon. It sustains otters. It is monitored for water quality by the Port of London Authority and assessed against environmental standards that would have been incomprehensible to the Victorians who built the first great sewer system. The long process of cleaning the river that Joseph Bazalgette began by redirecting the waste downstream, and that the Princess Alice disaster helped accelerate by making the costs of that redirection undeniable, continued across 5 or 6 generations before it reached anything like its present state. The Royal Albert Dock opened in 1880, 2 years after the disaster. It provided enclosed dock space that separated the heavy goods traffic, the colliers, the cargo steamers, the vessels like the Bywell Castle, from the pleasure and passenger traffic using the open river. The separation was not total, and the Thames remained a working, mixed-traffic waterway, but the structural division of river use that the Royal Albert Dock enabled reduced the probability of a repeat collision of the kind that had occurred at Gallions Reach. The London Steamboat Company did not survive. It went into bankruptcy within 6 years of the disaster. Its successor company failed within 3 years of beginning operations. Historian Jerry White, writing about the tidal Thames in the Victorian era, observed that the sinking had some impact in blighting the tidal river as a pleasure ground. The pleasure steamer trade on the lower Thames never fully recovered the confidence and the volume that it had carried in the summer of 1878. People still went on the river. The excursions continued, but something had changed in the relationship between the city and its waterway, and it did not change back. The pressure for passenger safety regulation on pleasure steamers, the requirement that a vessel should carry a counted and recorded list of the people aboard it, that life-saving equipment should be mandated and not merely suggested, that a vessel should carry sufficient crew to manage its passengers in an emergency, moved through the machinery of government in the years after the disaster. The London Steamboat Company had operated within the law as it stood. The law was changed. The precise statutory instruments took time, and the process was not as rapid as the scale of the disaster demanded, but the direction was set. The passengers who had boarded the Princess Alice at Swan Pier on the morning of the 3rd of September 1878 had no reason to think about any of this. They were going to Rocherville. They were going to spend a day at the seaside, on the river, with their families. They had 2 shillings in their pockets and a long, fine summer Tuesday ahead of them. The band was already playing on the lower deck as the steamer moved out from the pier, and the Thames was silver in the morning light, and London's spires and cranes receded behind them as they moved east toward the open water. That absence is not an abstraction. In the days after the disaster, the bereaved came to Woolwich dockyard, and to the town hall, and to the makeshift mortuaries established along the riverbank. They came looking for their husbands, their wives, their children, their parents. The bodies were laid in rows. The condition of many of them after days in the heavily contaminated water of Gallions Reach was such that identification could not always be made by sight alone. Relatives searched the clothing, the jewellery, the personal objects, a brooch, a pair of shoes, a coat, because the face was sometimes not enough, and for some who searched there was nothing to find. Their sister, or their husband, or their mother was not among the recovered dead because they had not been recovered, because the tidal river had carried them out, and they would surface eventually at Limehouse or at Erith, or they would not surface at all. No passenger list existed against which to check the living against the dead. The families of the victims had to learn of their losses by presence and by absence, by the empty seat at the table, by the ticket stub found in a coat pocket, by the children asking where their mother was. The newspapers of the following days published columns of descriptions, notices from families searching, appeals for identification, descriptions of the dead who had not yet been named. The process was slow, incomplete, and for some families never resolved. Those interred in the mass grave at Woolwich Cemetery on the 9th of September were unidentified at burial. They remain unidentified in the record today. These were the foreseeable and foreseen consequences of running a passenger service without a passenger list. The London Steamboat Company had operated without such lists throughout its commercial history. The law did not require them. The cost of keeping them, the modest administrative effort of recording a name at the gangway, had never been weighed against the cost of not keeping them, because that cost had not previously been demonstrated in terms so stark and so public. The coroner's inquest called explicitly for mandatory passenger counts. It called for stringent navigation regulations. It found that the Princess Alice had been inadequately crewed, insufficiently equipped, and loaded beyond the safety provision she carried. These findings were placed formally in the public record in November of 1878. They were not ignored, but they were acted on through the measured machinery of parliamentary and regulatory reform which operates at its own pace. The gap between disaster and remedy, the months and years between a formal inquest finding and the enacted rule change, is itself a part of the story. It is the space in which the institutional inertia lives. The majority of those who died on the evening of the 3rd of September were, as the surviving accounts make clear, women and children. The Princess Alice on a Tuesday evening returned from Rocherville was not a vessel of lone working men. It was carrying family parties, mothers and their children, couples, domestic groups. The men who boarded that morning and survived to give testimony, the Henry Reeds, the George Alexander Hayneses, were among those whose accounts entered the record precisely because they lived. The women and children who made up so much of the passenger complement and who died at a rate that reflects the difficulty of escaping from below decks and of surviving in the river, left a much thinner trace in the archive. Among the 28 bodies laid in the town hall at Woolwich in the days following the disaster was a manager's wife and her 4 children, 5 members of one family in a municipal building in the industrial east of London waited to be identified. They are there in the historical record as a count, not as names. The London Steamboat Company had never written down their names. The scale of 650 deaths requires something beyond numbers to land. The mass burial at Woolwich Cemetery on the 9th of September 1878 was attended by several thousand people. On that same day, more than 150 private funerals took place across East London, in Woolwich and Plumstead, in Greenwich and Bermondsey, in Bow and Poplar. Streets that had been ordinary streets on the morning of the 3rd of September were streets in which a household was gone, or half gone. The ordinary map of London's eastern suburbs was redrawn, quietly and permanently, by a Tuesday evening on the river. The Lord Mayor's fund at £35,000 was a substantial sum by the standards of Victorian charitable response. It was not wealth, distributed among the bereaved families of several hundred dead, widowers with no income, households stripped of their primary earner, children left without mothers. £35,000 was the margin, in the most practical sense, between destitution and the possibility of continuing. Queen Victoria's £100 and the Prince and Princess of Wales's 50 were gestures of institutional sympathy, sincere within their limits and inadequate in proportion. The people who contributed 6pence each, 23,000 of them, to fund the Celtic Cross at Woolwich Cemetery understood the scale of the loss rather better than the Mansion House donors, because they were the same class of person as those who had drowned. The cross was erected in May of 1880. It stands above the mass grave. It was built from the accumulated small contributions of working people who had no particular personal connection to the disaster beyond the fact that they could have been on that boat. Any of them could have been on that boat. Any clerk, any artisan, any factory hand, any mother taking her children for a summer day out had the same 2 shillings and the same ticket and the same reasonable expectation of arriving home by 9 o'clock. The 6pence subscription understood that, in a way that official inquiries and corporate statements and parliamentary committee reports perhaps could not. The inquiry findings, meanwhile, worked their slow way through the system. The navigation rules for Thames steam traffic were reviewed and clarified. The port-to-port requirement was more precisely codified. The specific ambiguity of the slack waterline practice, the course that placed pleasure steamers crossing the path of channel traffic at the bends of the lower river, was addressed. The reform did not come in a single act, named for the Princess Alice. It came in the accumulated weight of official findings pressing against the regulatory inertia of a system that preferred to leave such matters to professional judgment until professional judgment was demonstrated to be insufficient. The Thames Marine Police received their first steam launches in the mid-1880s. By 1898, 8 steam-powered launches were operating on the river. A rowing boat had been adequate for the ordinary policing of a busy waterway. It had been entirely useless at Gallions Reach on the evening of the 3rd of September. The coroner's inquest had said so, formally, in the public record. The reform came. It came 7 years after the disaster, which was 7 years too late for anyone who died that evening, and it came in time for whatever disaster the steam launches were subsequently able to help prevent or mitigate, which is a calculation that cannot be made with certainty, but which was the basis on which the investment was eventually justified. The sewage reform was the longest in its unfolding and the most consequential in its ultimate reach. The Metropolitan Board of Works did not transform its outfall practices overnight. The political pressure created by the Princess Alice, the public understanding, vivid and personal in a way that public health statistics are not, of what it meant to fall into the Thames at Gallions Reach, combined with the prior scientific argument for treating sewage rather than merely transporting it. From the 1880s, the board began the process of concentrating the sewage solids at Barking and Crossness and loading them onto sludge boats for sea disposal. The first such vessel entered service in June of 1887. It was named the Bazalgette after the engineer who had built the sewer network and at whose outfall pipes the river had been contaminated. The naming is a Victorian detail that takes a moment to absorb. The vessel built to carry away the sewage that Bazalgette's system had accumulated was given the name of the man who had concentrated it in one place. Whether the Board of Works intended irony or tribute, the record does not say. The Bazalgette and the sludge boats that followed her ran for over a century. The programme of sea disposal continued until December of 1998, when improved treatment technology made it no longer necessary. 110 years of sludge boats, sailing from the Thames outfalls to the open sea, began from the political pressure that the Princess Alice disaster had helped generate. The river today is clean enough to support salmon and otters and a range of fish species that had been absent from the tidal Thames for generations. The journey from the contaminated water of Gallions Reach to a river where salmon run took 5 or 6 generations. The Princess Alice did not cause that transformation by itself, but it was one of the events that made the old arrangement untenable, and its weight in the history of Thames water quality is not incidental. The specific fate of each person whose name appears in the inquiry record deserves a moment of attention before this account concludes its work. Christopher Dix, the 34-year Thames pilot who had ordered engines reversed in the last seconds before the collision, had his licence suspended. He had, by the Board of Trade's own finding, done nothing wrong. He had been on the Bywell Castle's bridge and had acted correctly and could not have stopped the collision once it was set in motion. His licence was suspended nonetheless. The inquiry's reasoning for this, why a man found blameless by his own body would have his professional credentials revoked, is not fully explained in the surviving record. Dix returned to his life on the river because a Thames pilot of 34 years' experience has no other professional life to return to. The record does not preserve what he made of the evening of the 3rd of September for the remaining years of his career. George Thomas Long, first mate of the Princess Alice, also had his licence suspended. He had survived the collision that killed his captain and 650 of the people whose safety he was partly responsible for. He gave evidence at the inquest and at the Board of Trade inquiry. He answered the questions put to him by the coroner and the Board of Trade inspectors with the care of a man who understood that his words were being weighed. He could not explain with any certainty what Ayers had been attempting with the helm movement that crossed the Bywell Castle's bow, because the bridge communication in the final seconds before a close-quarters collision at dusk is not the kind of information that survives clearly in anyone's memory. He gave his account, and it was entered in the record, and his licence was suspended, and the Princess Alice was scrapped, and the matter moved into the legal and political phase of its long aftermath. Captain Thomas Harrison of the Bywell Castle outlived the inquiry, the civil suit, and the suspension of his licence. He had given his account of the moments before the collision at every forum that requested it: the coroner's inquest, the Board of Trade. His account and the account of Abraham Dennis, master of the Bonetta, did not agree. The inquiry chose to credit the navigational analysis over the eyewitness testimony. Harrison returned to command. The Bywell Castle returned to trade. On the 29th of January, 1883, the Bywell Castle was reported overdue from a voyage from Alexandria to Hull. She was believed lost in a Bay of Biscay gale, the same storm that took the Kenmure Castle in February of that year. All 40 of her crew died. The ship that struck the Princess Alice at Gallions Reach sank in the Atlantic 4.5 years later, taking with her whatever further account her officers might have given. Whatever detail of the evening of the 3rd of September remained in Thomas Harrison's memory. She left no wreck that has been found. William Grinstead, described at the inquest as sober, steady, and careful, is buried somewhere. His body was recovered from the Thames in the days after the disaster. He commanded the Princess Alice for the last time on a Tuesday evening in September, and his last recorded words were shouted from his bridge into the dark above the water and heard by those on the Bywell Castle who were close enough to hear. The Board of Trade placed its primary finding of fault on his vessel. He could not contest it. His name is in the record as the master of a ship that made the navigational error that killed 650 people, and in the same record as a man who was known, by those who worked alongside him, as a careful and conscientious professional who did not deserve the reputation the collision gave him, who did not deserve any of what the evening of the 3rd of September made him responsible for. He did not survive to defend himself. The board's verdict is the one that stands. The 3rd of September, 1878 ended the same way it began, the Thames running where it had always run, the lights of Woolwich reflected in the dark water, the city going about the ordinary business of a Tuesday night. Those who stood on the bank that evening and watched the rescue boats, working galleons, reach in the dark, were watching the aftermath of a day that had started with 2 shillings and a brass band and the smell of the river in the morning. The passengers of the Princess Alice had not gone looking for history. They had gone to Rocherville. They had danced or watched others dance. They had eaten their packed dinners on the open deck. They had boarded the homeward steamer in the ordinary way, at the ordinary hour, fully expecting to be home by 9 o'clock. 650 of them were not. And because the London Steamboat Company had never been required to write down their names, because the law had never demanded that a company know exactly who was aboard its vessel when it set out, the precise number of those who died in the Thames at Gallions Reach on the evening of the 3rd of September, 1878 remains unknown. It will always be unknown. That uncertainty is not a footnote. It is the clearest possible statement of what the Victorian regulatory framework thought a working-class life was worth on a pleasure steamer. Not enough to count, not enough to record, not enough to know. The Celtic cross at Woolwich Cemetery was paid for 6pence at a time by 23,000 people who understood that something needed to stand at the place where the dead had been put into the ground. It still stands. The river has been cleaned, the navigation rules tightened, the police launches long since steam-powered and then engine-powered, and now as sophisticated as anything working on the water. The sludge boats ran for 110 years, and the Thames today carries salmon where it once carried 75 million gallons of raw sewage twice a day. The Princess Alice disaster is one of the reasons those things are true. Not the only reason, not the sufficient cause, but one of the weights that tip the calculation, the undeniable, public, catastrophic demonstration of what happened when the engineering triumph of the great sewer system and the commercial convenience of no passenger list and the professional autonomy of the navigation rules all arrived at the same point on the river at the same moment. The shore lights of Woolwich were visible from the water on the evening of the 3rd of September. The people who were in the Thames could see the city. The city was right there, and the city's entire sewage system was in the water around them, and the city's river police were rowing toward them in the dark, and the city's laws had never required the company to know their names. 650 people went to Rocherville on a Tuesday in September and did not come home. The river remembers the reach, the cemetery holds the cross, and the names, most of the name, were never written down.